courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a sterile stage for justice that felt anything but just. The old man sat at the defense table, wrists bound in cold steel cuffs, his faded flannel shirt still speckled with dried blood from 3 nights ago. His gray hair was matted, one eye swollen shut, and his weathered face bore the weight of decades. At 68, James Jim Callahan looked like any other down-on-his-luck drifter in the eyes of the court, nobody worth a second glance. The prosecutor, a young hotshot named Bradley Turner, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk curling his lips. "Let's not waste the court's time," Turner scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "No lawyer, no defense. Move it along." Jim didn't flinch. He didn't speak. His eyes, sharp despite the bruising, stayed fixed on the American flag hanging above the judge's bench, a symbol he'd once carried into battle, now the only thing in this room that didn't feel like it was judging him. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s named Margaret Holt, adjusted her glasses and sighed. "Mr. Callahan, do you understand the charges against you? Obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. Do you have counsel?" Her tone was clipped, impatient, as if she'd already decided the outcome. Jim's silence answered her. The public defender assigned to him had bailed hours earlier, muttering about a plea deal and a backlog of cases before vanishing to another courtroom. No family, no friends, no one to stand beside him, just Jim, alone, in a system that had already written him off. 3 days earlier, the trouble had started outside Grace Haven, a women's shelter tucked in the shadow of downtown Pittsburgh's steel and glass skyline. The evening was cold, the kind of late autumn chill that bit through worn jackets and settled into old bones. Jim had been passing by, his boots scuffing the cracked sidewalk, when he heard the shouting. A security guard, a burly man named Vince Russo, was towering over a woman curled up against the shelter's brick wall. She was young, maybe 30, with matted hair and eyes wide with terror. Her hands clutched her ears, her body trembling as Russo barked orders. "You missed curfew! Get out of here now!" His voice was a blade cutting through the quiet street. The woman, later identified as Sarah Miller, whimpered, her breathing ragged, trapped in a PTSD-fueled panic that Jim recognized instantly. He'd seen that look before. In the jungles of Vietnam, in the eyes of soldiers under fire, in the mirror some nights when the nightmares came. Jim didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his bad knee creaking, and placed himself between Sarah and Russo. "Easy now," he said, voice low and steady, the way he'd calm green recruits under mortar fire. "She's not a threat. She's just scared." His outstretched hand was open, non-threatening, but Russo wasn't having it. The guard's face reddened, his ego bruised by this old man in a threadbare coat daring to intervene. "Back off, Grandpa, or you're going to regret it," Russo snapped, shoving Jim's shoulder. Jim didn't budge. He'd faced worse than an overzealous rent-a-cop, enemy snipers, minefields, the weight of command. He kept his eyes on Sarah, speaking softly. "Breathe, ma'am. Just breathe. You're safe." But the situation spiraled. A bystander's 911 call brought squad cars screaming in, lights flashing like a war zone. The responding officers, led by a young cop named Officer Derek Hayes, didn't ask questions. They saw Russo pointing at Jim, heard the word assault, and acted. "Get on the ground," Hayes shouted, taser already drawn. Jim tried to explain, his voice drowned out by the chaos. When he didn't move fast enough, his knee locked up from old shrapnel wounds. The taser's prongs hit him square in the chest. He crumpled, blood trickling from where his head struck the pavement. They cuffed him, dragged him to the squad car, and booked him without a second thought. Russo's report claimed Jim had shoved him, resisted arrest, and caused a scene. Sarah, still shaking, was hustled away by shelter staff before anyone could get her statement. The truth didn't make it to the police report. The local news didn't help. Channel 5 ran a segment that night, the headline screaming, "Vagrant resists arrest outside women's shelter." The anchor's polished voice described a violent altercation, flashing Jim's mug shot, a grim image of a bloodied, disheveled old man. No one mentioned the Bronze Star he'd earned in '71. pinned on him after he dragged two wounded soldiers out of a burning chopper under enemy fire. No one mentioned the decades he'd spent mentoring young Marines after the war, teaching them not just how to fight, but how to live with what they'd seen. The news didn't show the commendation letters from generals or the scars, physical and mental, that Jim carried. They saw what they wanted: a troublemaker, a nobody. Back in the courtroom, the air was thick with indifference. Turner, the prosecutor, flipped through his files with a practiced ease, his suit crisp, his confidence unshakable. Your Honor, the defendant was offered a plea deal, 90 days. He's got no representation, no defense, and frankly, no reason to drag this out. He shot a glance at Jim, as if daring him to speak. Jim didn't. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, staring at the flag like it was the last piece of his world that still made sense. Judge Holt tapped her pen, her patience thinning. Mr. Callahan, I'll ask again. Do you understand the charges? Do you have anything to say? The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Turner's smirk widened, sensing an easy win. The handful of spectators, a board reporter, a couple of court regulars, shifted in their seats, ready for the gavel to fall. Then the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. Heads turned. The murmur of the gallery died. A man strode in, his polished boots clicking on the tile floor, his marine dress blues immaculate silver oak leaves glinting on his shoulders. Colonel Nathan Brooks, 52, active duty, decorated. A man whose presence filled the room without a word. His combat ribbons gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his jaw set, with a quiet fury that made the air feel charged. He didn't look at the judge, didn't acknowledge Turner's stunned expression. He walked straight to the defense table, pulled out the chair beside Jim, and sat down. Leaning close, he whispered just loud enough for the front row to hear, "You taught me what it means to stand for something, Gunny. I'm here now." The courtroom froze. Turner's smirk vanished. Judge Holt's pen stopped midair. The reporter in the back row scrambled for her notebook. And Jim Callahan, for the first time in 3 days, lifted his eyes from the flag and looked at the man beside him. A man he'd once carried through hell. A man who hadn't forgotten. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension as Colonel Nathan Brooks sat beside Jim Callahan, his marine dress blues a stark contrast to the drab indifference of the room. The silver oak leaves on his shoulders caught the light, but it was the fire in his eyes that held the gallery captive. Judge Margaret Holt's pen hovered, her stern facade cracking under the weight of Brooks' arrival. Prosecutor Bradley Turner's confidence, so smug moments ago, faltered as he shuffled his files, his smirk replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. The spectators, once half asleep, leaned forward, sensing the shift, their whispers buzzing like static. Jim, still cuffed, glanced at Brooks, his bruised face unreadable, but his eyes betraying a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Brooks stood, his posture ramrod straight, and addressed the court with a voice that cut through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, I'm here for James Callahan, a man who saved my life when I was just a scared kid in a war zone. He's no criminal. He's a hero, and this court's about to hear why." Turner shot to his feet, his voice sharp. "Objection, this is irregular. The colonel's not a licensed attorney. He can't." Brooks didn't flinch. "I'm not his attorney," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. "I'm his witness. I'm here to tell you who this man is because clearly nobody bothered to ask." Judge Holt raised a hand, silencing Turner. Her eyes narrowed, intrigued. "Colonel Brooks, you have my attention. Proceed." Brooks took a breath, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Jim. "In 1972, I was a 19-year-old private, green as they come, dropped into a classified op in Vietnam. Our squad was ambushed, comms down, extraction gone, pinned under fire in a jungle that wanted us dead. Jim Callahan, then a gunnery sergeant, was our leader. He took a bullet in his knee, shrapnel in his shoulder, but when I got hit, when I couldn't walk, he slung me over his back and carried me 11 miles through hell. 11 miles. Your Honor, with enemy patrols closing in, his blood soaking the ground. He didn't leave me. He didn't leave any of us." His voice cracked, just for a moment, and the courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. A woman in the gallery wiped her eyes. The reporter's pen froze mid-scratch. Brooks reached into a leather portfolio and produced a stack of documents, their edges worn but official seals unmistakable. This is Jim's service record. Bronze Star with Valor for that mission, 3 commendations for courage, decades training Marines, over 2,000 of us, who learned to survive because of him. He taught us not just how to fight, but how to carry the weight of war and still stand tall. He slid the papers across to the judge, who took them with a slow, deliberate hand. This man, Brooks continued, his voice rising, stood between a terrified woman and a bully 3 nights ago, just like he stood between me and death 50 years ago. And what did he get? A taser, handcuffs, a mugshot splashed across the news, calling him a vagrant. He turned to Turner, his eyes blazing. You didn't look at the body cam footage. You didn't talk to the woman he protected. You saw an old man in a worn coat and decided he was nothing. That's not justice. That's laziness. Turner bristled, his face flushing. Your Honor, this is emotional grandstanding. The police report clearly states. Brooks cut him off, his voice like steel. The police report is a lie by omission. It says Jim resisted, but it doesn't say why. It doesn't say he was shielding Sarah Miller, a woman with PTSD, from a guard screaming in her face. It doesn't say he never raised a fist, never threatened anyone. It doesn't say your officers tased a man with shrapnel in his knee because they didn't bother to listen. The gallery erupted in murmurs, a tide of outrage swelling. A man in the back, wearing a faded Vietnam vet cap, clenched his fists, tears streaking his weathered cheeks. Judge Holt banged her gavel, but her eyes were locked on Brooks, her expression unreadable. I'm asking for 48 hours, Brooks said, his voice steady but urgent. Give us time to get the evidence you should have had from the start. Security footage, Sarah Miller's statement, the truth. Jim Callahan deserves that. This country owes him that. Turner opened his mouth to object, but Judge Holt cut him off. Enough, she said, her voice sharp but shaken. Colonel, you're treading on thin ice, but I'm inclined to agree that this case has holes. You have 48 hours. I expect evidence, not just stories. She paused, her gaze shifting to Jim, who hadn't spoken a word. Mr. Callahan, is this true? Were you protecting someone? Jim's voice, rough from days of silence, was quiet but firm. Yes, ma'am. She was scared. I saw it in her eyes. Same look I saw in war. I just stood there, didn't hit nobody. They didn't ask why. The judge's face softened, just for a moment, before she nodded. Court's adjourned. 48 hours. As the gavel fell, the gallery buzzed, reporters scrambling for their phones, spectators whispering in disbelief. Brooks placed a hand on Jim's shoulder, his voice low. You're not alone anymore, Gunny. Not today, not ever. Jim's eyes glistened, but he only nodded, his jaw tight. Outside the courtroom, the world was already shifting. Brooks didn't waste a second of the 48 hours. He assembled a team of 3 attorneys, veterans' rights specialists who'd served under Jim's influence years ago. They scoured the shelter's security footage, which showed Jim stepping calmly between Sarah and the guard, his arms outstretched, voice soft, posture defensive. The tape caught every word. She's having a flashback. Give her space. It showed Russo shoving Jim, Jim standing firm, and the police arriving, tasers drawn, no questions asked. The footage was damning, a clear picture of a man protecting, not provoking. Then there was Sarah Miller. It took hours to find her tucked away in a temporary shelter, still shaken but willing to talk. Her voice trembled as she recounted the night to Brooks' team. I was losing it, she said, her hands twisting in her lap. The guard was yelling. The lights were too bright. It felt like my ex was back, screaming at me. Jim, he saw it. He knew. He stood there talking soft, like he was pulling me out of a nightmare. He didn't touch the guard, didn't yell. He just helped me breathe. Her eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. They shocked him because of me. He was trying to save me, and they hurt him. The attorneys recorded her statement, her words a lifeline for Jim's case, a testament to the man he'd always been. As the 40-hour deadline loomed, word spread beyond the courtroom. Veterans groups caught wind of Jim's story, and social media lit up with hashtags, Justice for Jim, Hero Not Vagrant. A local radio host, a former Marine, choked up on air recounting how Jim had mentored him in the ADS, teaching him to face fear with dignity. By the time the court reconvened, the gallery was packed. Veterans in uniform lined the walls, civilians filled every seat, and reporters jostled for space. The air was electric, charged with anticipation and anger. Jim, now in a clean shirt provided by Brooks, sat taller, his cuffs gone, but his scars still visible. Brooks stood beside him, a leather portfolio in hand, ready to fight. The truth was coming, and it would break the room wide open. The Pittsburgh courtroom, once a cold arena of routine judgments, was now a crucible of raw emotion. The gallery overflowed, a sea of faces, veterans in faded caps, shelter volunteers, reporters with flashing cameras, and ordinary citizens drawn by the wildfire of Jim Callahan's story. The air hummed with anticipation. Every breath held as Judge Margaret Holt leaned forward, her glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. Colonel Nathan Brooks stood beside Jim, his Marine dress blues a beacon of resolve, his leather portfolio open to the damning evidence that had reshaped this case. Jim, no longer cuffed, sat with a quiet dignity, his weathered hands folded, his eyes fixed on the flag above the bench. A symbol he'd fought for, bled for, and now, perhaps, would be seen for. Judge Holt cleared her throat, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what she'd heard. "Mr. Callahan," she began, removing her glasses, "this court has failed you. We saw a mugshot, not a man. We saw a charge, not a hero. The evidence, security footage, Miss Miller's testimony, and Colonel Brooks' documentation paints a clear picture. You acted to protect a vulnerable woman, and for that you were wronged." She paused, her gaze softening as it met Jim's. "The charges of obstruction and resisting arrest are dismissed with prejudice. On behalf of this court, I apologize." A gasp rippled through the gallery. A veteran in the back row, his face carved with years of hardship, wiped tears from his eyes. The reporter from Channel 5, who'd once branded Jim a vagrant, scribbled furiously, her face pale with realization. Prosecutor Bradley Turner stood, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a rare humility. He adjusted his tie, his voice low. "Your Honor, I misjudged this case. I didn't dig deep enough. Mr. Callahan, I'm sorry." He extended a hand across the aisle, a gesture that hung in the air like a fragile truce. Jim, ever steady, shook it without hesitation. "We all miss things sometimes," he said, his voice rough but kind, a lesson in grace that silenced the room. The gavel fell and the courtroom erupted, not in chaos but in a swell of emotion. Veterans saluted, spectators clapped, their applause a thunderous acknowledgement of a man reclaimed. Colonel Brooks placed a hand on Jim's shoulder, whispering, "You're seen now, Gunny. You always were to me." As Jim stepped out of the courthouse, the autumn sun broke through Pittsburgh's gray skyline, casting a warm glow on his bruised face. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, but Jim didn't flinch. He straightened his borrowed tie, his bad knee trembling, but his resolve unshaken. "I'm no hero," he told the reporters, his voice cutting through their clamor. "I just did what any of us would, saw someone hurting, and stepped in. The real story ain't me. It's how quick we forget to look deeper." His words, simple yet searing, hit the crowd like a gut punch. A young girl clutching a small American flag tugged at her father's sleeve, whispering, "Is he a soldier, Daddy?" The man, a veteran himself, nodded, his eyes wet. "He's more than that, sweetheart. He's the best of us." The city didn't forget Jim Callahan. Within days, Pittsburgh's mayor announced a Civic Honor Award to be presented at a ceremony in front of City Hall. Veterans groups rallied, filling the square with uniforms and flags, their presence a silent rebuke to the system that had overlooked one of their own. Jim accepted the award not for himself, but for every vet still waiting to be seen. His voice cracking as he spoke, the crowd roared, their cheers echoing off the steel towers, a city awakening to its own conscience. Gracehaven, the shelter where it all began, renamed itself Callahan House, unveiling new policies to train staff in recognizing trauma responses. "We failed Sarah Miller," the director admitted publicly, her voice breaking. "And we failed Jim. Never again. The shelter became a beacon, a safe haven for those carrying invisible wounds, with Jim's name etched on its cornerstone. The Pittsburgh Police Department, stung by the oversight, mandated training on PTSD for all officers, with Jim invited to co-lead the first session. Officer Derek Hayes, the cop who'd tased him, attended, his head bowed as Jim spoke about the panic in Sarah's eyes, the kind he'd seen in war zones and still saw in his own nightmares. "You don't need a gun to de-escalate," Jim told the room, his voice steady. "You just need to listen." Hayes approached him after, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who you were, sir. I'll do better." Jim nodded, his hand on the young officer's shoulder. "That's all any of us can do." Jim's life shifted in ways he never expected. The Veteran Center downtown offered him a small office where he began counseling others, men and women haunted by the same ghosts he carried. His calendar filled with appointments, his days with purpose. One evening, as he sat with a young Marine struggling to sleep through his own night terrors, Jim shared a story he rarely told, the night 72, when he carried Brooks through the jungle, certain they'd both die. "You keep going," he told the Marine, his eyes distant but warm. "Not because you're strong, but because someone needs you to." The Marine nodded, tears falling, and Jim felt a piece of himself heal. But the story didn't end neatly. As Jim's name became a rallying cry, whispers of pushback emerged. A local politician, eyeing re-election, called the media frenzy overblown, hinting that Jim's actions had still disrupted public order. A few officers grumbled about the new training, resistant to change. And Sarah Miller, though safe, vanished from the shelter circuit, her whereabouts unknown, leaving Jim to wonder if she'd ever know the impact she'd had on his life. One night, as he walked past Callahan House, a letter slipped under the door, caught his eye. Unsigned, it read, "You gave me a chance to breathe again. I'm trying to find my way. Thank you, Jim." He folded it carefully, tucking it into his coat, his heart heavy with questions. Was it Sarah? Would she be okay? The uncertainty gnawed at him, a reminder that some battles never fully end. Colonel Brooks visited monthly, bringing cadets to meet the man who'd shaped him. During one visit, as they sat in Jim's cramped office, Brooks leaned forward, his voice low. "You didn't just save me in that jungle, Gunny. You're saving this city, one truth at a time." Jim shook his head, a faint smile breaking through. "We save each other, Nate. That's the only fight worth winning." Outside, the city hummed, its systems slowly shifting. Cops asking better questions, shelters offering safer spaces, veterans finding voices. But as Jim looked out his window, the skyline blurring in the dusk, he knew the real war was far from over. Somewhere out there, another Sarah was hiding, another vet was unseen. And Jim Callahan, scars and all, would keep standing, keep listening, keep fighting. For them, for himself, for a world that might one day see clearly.